Welcome to the agenda with me, Lasha Kingsley in Douala, Cameroon. Before the outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic in Cameroon, the United Nations International Children Emergency Fund in November 2019 revealed that more than 855,000 children remained out of schools in the northwest and southwest regions of Cameroon. As the humanitarian situation worsens in the conflict-stricken regions, NGOs seem to be paying the heavy price of the war, as a local volunteer of Doctors Without Borders was recently killed. Our guest on today's program is Dr. Labang Oscar, president of the Labang Foundation, a U.S. non-profit organization which works with education and training organizations in the northwest and southwest regions of the country, as well as the far north region. He was part of the Education Commission during the major national dialogue which held in Yaoundé last year. Stay with us. Dr. Labang Oscar in Texas, USA. Welcome to the agenda.
Thank you very much, Kingsley.
The pleasure is equally shared. This is the first time we are having you on the program. I am interested, like our viewership of the viewership of this program, in knowing who you are. Can you briefly introduce yourself to the million televiewers who are watching at this time?
Well, like you said, I live in Texas, USA, Cameroonian born. From the Ngokutunja division in the Northwest region. I hold a PhD in English from the Department of English at the University of Yaoundé 1. I currently work for the United States Department of Homeland Security, and I am also the president of the Labang Education Foundation, as well as the CEO of Miracle Publishing.
That's a very rich professional and educational background there. Doc, you took part in the major national dialogue which held in Yaoundé from September 30th to October 4th, 2019. And you guys took certain decisions at the major national dialogue. When you look at the state of affairs of things, or the security situation of Cameroon right now, how do you rate the major national dialogue as an individual or somebody who took part during the discussions, and somebody who works for the United States of America precisely for Homeland Security?
Now, in terms of the major national dialogue itself, I would say it was successful. In terms of the implementation of the recommendations from the national dialogue, the major national dialogue, it has not been as successful as one would expect. Kingsley, there is something about the major national dialogue that people have been talking about, but nobody seems to pay attention to that. Now, one of the strongest and most useful recommendations of the major national dialogue was not the special status which a lot of people put out there. One of the recommendations which was echoed in all the commissions at the major national dialogue, nobody seems to be talking about that.
And what is that recommendation?
That recommendation, which was mentioned in different forms in all the commissions at the major national dialogue, was a ceasefire, a resolution of the conflict, and a return to peace. That is the only resolution which came up in all the commissions. And that came up in all the commissions because for the Education Commission to implement all the good ideas they put in place, there needs to be peace. There needs to be a return to order. For the Decentralization Commission, for the Reconstruction Commission, for the Bilingualism Commission, and all the other commissions, all the wonderful ideas, all the wonderful recommendations they made can only be implemented if the first and most important recommendation of a ceasefire, a resolution of the conflict, and a return to peace is achieved. So even the special status and the decentralization stuff which people have been selling out there very loudly has a precondition. Decentralization or the special status cannot be implemented if there is not a ceasefire, a resolution of the conflict, and a return to normalcy.
The question many Cameroonians, the question many Cameroonians, Doc, are asking or wondering, pondering over is, how do we get this ceasefire? Because we've had messages circulating on social media and other media platforms that there was a purported ceasefire talks between jailed Ambazonia leaders and the government of the Republic of Cameroon, which the government recently, through its spokesperson, Rene Emmanuel Sadi, said the messages or the information being relayed do not conform with the realities on the ground.
Now, that's a two-part question. The first part is, how will that ceasefire be achieved? Then I'll get to the communique, the talks in the second part. Now, in the first part, the ceasefire has to be a negotiation. Now, like I said from the beginning, every person who attended the major national dialogue was concerned about the return of peace. And that is why that recommendation came up in all the commissions in different forms. Now, it is, once that recommendation has been made, it is now the responsibility of the government to now either put together a post-dialogue committee to ask them, how do we go about this ceasefire? Should it be a negotiated ceasefire? There are multiple ways through which a conflict can come to an end. Now, it is the responsibility of the government. There are people like myself from the civil society who were there just to give ideas, just to propose possible solutions. Now, when we leave, the government has to say, okay, some members of government, some members from the civil society, some members from religious organizations, some members from the private sector, all of you come back together. This major national dialogue said we should restore peace so that all these other wonderful ideas can be implemented. How do we restore peace? And then the government will now develop a framework for the restoration of peace. Now, if the government doesn't want to negotiate, well, it's a conflict, it's a war. Another way of resolving a war is outright defeat, so that the enemy surrenders.
In this case, when you talk about enemies, those are citizens who are dying, both the military and...
Yes. No, when I talk about the enemy, I'm not necessarily talking about Ambazonians. I'm talking in a general context. That's why I say one of the methods is outright defeat of your opponent. You can resolve the conflict through outright defeat. But if you value human lives, if you value the communities that have developed themselves, if you value peace and stability, then outright defeat of the opponent is not the best option. Dialogue or a negotiated peace settlement is the best option. And that option is also available to the government. And that brings me to the second part of your question.
Yes.
About circulations online, the communique from the Ambazonian leadership in jail. Now, Kingsley, I must note that a lot of Cameroonians took that communique from the prison, the leaders in prison, with a lot of enthusiasm, because people want peace. The ordinary Cameroonian wants peace. The ordinary Cameroonian wants a return to normalcy. So a negotiation between the government and the leadership of the struggle is very, very important. But when the minister came out in his communique, one thing we must note, Kingsley, is that the minister did not outrightly say, no, there was no dialogue with the leaders in prison.
You said do not conform with realities.
He said the communique, or that the information that is circulation does not conform to reality. Now, this means one of two things.
Yes.
Kingsley, if I tell you that the suit you are wearing or the shirt you are wearing is my shirt that you stole, if it is not my shirt, you're going to outrightly say, no, it is not your shirt. I bought it on this day. This is evidence that I bought it. This is evidence that I am the owner. But if you say that the statement I have made does not conform to reality, it means that it could be my shirt, but you did not steal it.
Okay, Doc.
It means that the dialogue, the discussion between the government and the Ambazonian leaders could have taken place, but the communique of the Ambazonian leaders does not represent it the way the government wanted it to be. So, if the minister wanted Cameroonians to know that there was no dialogue, he should have said, it is false, it is misleading, and there was no negotiation or pre-negotiation talks with the Ambazonian leaders. But when the minister says it does not represent reality, it means that there is a fact, but the fact was not properly represented.
Okay, Doc, you live and work for the government of the United States of America, precisely Homeland Security. Why, in your opinion, do you think that the government of Cameroon is calling some Cameroonians in the U.S. terrorists, but they still move about freely in the States?
Now, terrorism, one of the issues about terrorism is that the definition is contextual. What you might define as terrorism, or what one country might define in their laws as terrorism, is not necessarily what the other country or another country will define as terrorism. The Cameroon law might consider the activities of the individuals, or some of the individuals in the Ambazonian struggle in the United States as terrorism. But in the United States, that same element which is considered by Cameroon law as terrorism could be considered in the United States as freedom of speech.
This is interesting.
In which case now it becomes difficult for the United States to implement Cameroon's definition of terrorism. Now, I'll give you a typical example. If you take, for example, the original leaders of the contemporary Anglophone struggle, Barrister Bala, Dr. Fontaine, and the others who were arrested and imprisoned. Now, you will realize that amongst other things they were charged with, there was terrorism. But within the context of the United States, trade union leaders' demands do not constitute terrorism.
But there are evidence of war crime and crimes against humanity. We see some of these people, Cameroonian government calling them terrorists. They brandished, claim responsibilities over certain atrocities that we see over there in our regions, as well as in the other part of the country.
Good. That is a clear element. And that is why it is important that in such a situation, even though it is contextual to Cameroon, when we define terrorism in such a context, if you want to allow other countries, not just the United States, if you want to allow other countries to get involved in such a situation, then terrorism must be defined from an international context. Because if you define it only from the Cameroon context, then US law will apply, Norwegian law will apply differently, British law will apply differently. But if you define and justify terrorism in Cameroon from an international context, I'll give you a typical example. Boko Haram activities in northern Cameroon.
Yes.
It was defined as terrorism from an international context. And that is why the United States stepped in to help Cameroon combat terrorism in the north. That is why other countries that is why the AU, that is why Chad, that's why Nigeria, that's why Central African Republic, all of those countries are working with Cameroon to defend or resolve the terrorist problem in northern Cameroon. But when it comes to the northwest and southwest regions, terrorism is defined more from a contextual Cameroon perspective. Now, it makes it, as I said, difficult for other countries to apply Cameroon law. The United States doesn't apply Cameroon law. Britain, Sweden, and other countries, or Norway, wouldn't apply Cameroon law. They'll apply the laws of their country, but they have an obligation to international law and to international instruments. So the best way possible is to look at the Anglophone crisis, or the activities or crimes, as you said, against humanity and other things that are committed within the context of Cameroon, to look at that from the perspective of international law. That is the only way where you can now invite other countries to say, look at what is going on. This is the situation. Can you help? And I tell you, if other countries see that within the context of international law, these are terrorist acts, then those countries have an obligation within international law to now say, okay, let us combat terrorism in the northwest and southwest regions of Cameroon.
Doug, you made a very important point at the beginning of the interview, talking about a ceasefire for the regions, war-ravaged regions of the country. The concern of many Cameroonians now is that the government is going about the reconstruction plan ordered by President Paul Biya when the guns are still smoking. So how feasible is this reconstruction with the guns still smoking over there? And how do we get this ceasefire?
Unfortunately, Kingsley, we should not be looking at the feasibility of reconstruction at this point in Cameroon. Reconstruction is not the priority at this point.
Does it mean that there's somebody who is trying to, block the recommendations or the resolutions you guys took at the major national dialogue? Because you did say one of the priorities was a ceasefire, the call for ceasefire.
Yes, I am not necessarily going to say somebody is blocking them. Those recommendations were made to the government, and the government has to prioritize what they do at what time. But prioritizing what they do at what time should be guided by conventional logic. And that's why I said reconstruction should not be the priority at this time. Now, in Cameroon, Kingsley, within the context of Cameroon and the conflict that is going on right now, there is what I call the 4 Ps which should apply. The 4 Rs, sorry. The
yes.
First R is resolution of the conflict. The second R is reconstruction of infrastructure and services. The third P is repatriation. The third R is repatriation or return of displaced people. And the fourth R is reconciliation and reintegration. Now, these 4 R's are supposed to go in this logical order that I have presented. There must be a resolution to the crisis, the conflict, or the war, whatever an individual chooses to call it. After the resolution of the war or the conflict, we can go to reconstruction of infrastructure and services. When we have reconstructed the infrastructure and the services that people need to go back to a normal life, we can now repatriate or return displaced people to their community. When we return the displaced people, now we have to absolutely reconcile them, because the conflict is not just has deteriorated to the point where it is not just between the military and the Amazonians.
Yes.
There have been conflicts between families, conflicts within the community, conflicts between individuals, which do not even concern the military. So the 4th R should deal with reconciling the communities and then reintegrating them within the national context. And we have to be honest, Kingsley. There is only one test. Anybody who talks about reconstruction in Cameroon right now, Kingsley, there is one test you can administer to that person. And if they answer you honestly, then they can go ahead with reconstruction.
Now, what is that test?
Question. I have to ask them.
What is that test?
Kingsley, if your house is burning and your neighbors advise you to go into the fire and start rebuilding the house, will you go?
Unfortunately, I'm the one doing the asking.
Exactly. That suggests to me that personally you will not go. If you ask this question to Minister Paul Tasson, he is going to tell you that he will not go into a burning house, into his burning house, to start rebuilding it while it is still burning. If you ask that question to any individual in Cameroon,
there's some school of thoughts. Some school of thoughts believes that the reconstruction can move on with the negotiation at the same time.
That is, to be honest, not a realistic position. How do you reconstruct when a conflict is still going on? What if the conflict is not resolved? If both of them are going on at the same time, what if the negotiations fail? What happens? Everything that has been reconstructed gets destroyed again, because the conflict will start all over. So the logic that reconstruction and resolution of the conflict can go on at the same time, that logic is flawed. Unfortunately, it is not based on honesty. That logic is not based on humanitarian need. It is based on political expediency. And that is not the right thing the Cameroon government should be doing at this time. All resources, all finances, all energy in Cameroon at this time should be targeted and directed towards resolving the conflict. We can rebuild our communities when we have resolved the conflict. The importance of resolving the conflict first is not only reconstruction. In the Education Commission, where I participated in the national dialogue, we insisted on a ceasefire for humanitarian reasons. It was not for political reasons. It was not for reconstruction. We all agreed, everybody in that commission agreed that for education to re-begin or to start all over in the traditional sense in the Northwest and Southwest successfully, it was necessary for a humanitarian ceasefire. So if the government of Cameroon loves the people of the Northwest and the Southwest, if Mr. Biya loves the people of the Northwest and the Southwest, the first thing he has to do is not reconstruct. It is to save the lives of the people of the Northwest and Southwest who are currently dying because of the conflict. And that can only come through a negotiation for a ceasefire and a return to normalcy. Reconstruction is a long-term project.
Doc, when you return from
resolution of the crisis is an immediate term project.
Thank you. When you return from the major national dialogue, I'm mindful you live in the United States of America, and some of the people who are sponsoring or behind this crisis that has caused so much untold sufferings to the people of the Northwest and Southwest region reside in the United States of America. Have you had time to meet with some of these people? And when you meet them, what do you tell them about the suffering of your people?
No, about meeting them, no, I have not met with them. But I have talked with some of them. Because in all reality, these are our brothers and sisters. And from a personal perspective, and from the perspective of my non-profit organization, which I represented at the National Dialogue, I am looking at the humanitarian cost of the conflict. When I talk to people, when I talk to them about the conflict, I am not interested in the politics of it. I am interested in the humanitarian cost of the conflict. And that is why I just mentioned that if the government of Cameroon loves the people of the Northwest and the Southwest, it should be concerned about the lives that are being destroyed while the conflict is going on, rather than with rebuilding. Dead people cannot rebuild a community, but living people can rebuild their community even without the government. So the government's priority, and that's the same thing I tell the people of the Ambazonia camp, Ambazonia side. If you love your community, destruction and killing of people in your community should be the last option. Because at the end of the conflict, you will need each other. You will need everybody alive and well and strong to be able to rebuild the community. Even if it comes to the worst case or best case and there is separation, I still tell them, you cannot separate a country and have a territory with no people. That's why the killing of civilians must stop. Civilians are not part of the conflict. Civilians are not part of the crisis. Keep the civilians out of it, and the military or the government and the Ambazonian leadership can find their political method of resolving it, which of course we have continuously insisted and encouraged that it should be a negotiated dialogue, because weapons, war, and destruction leads to nothing other than death and chaos to humanity. So
okay.
A humanitarian perspective is the perspective from which we look at the conflict. And if when I'm talking to the government, if I have the opportunity, like during the major national dialogue, or I'm talking to the Ambazonians, those that I get the opportunity to talk to, I insist to them on the humanitarian need to end the violence.
Okay, Doc, you are the founder of an NGO, and your foundation focuses in 3 regions of the country. That's in the Northwest and Southwest region, as well as the far north region of the country. How have things changed since the crisis went military in 2017? We've seen you give assistance to children whenever is back to school, and even in the north and far north region where they are suffering from Boko Haram insurgency. So how have things changed with the outbreak or when the war in the Northwest and Southwest regions went military?
Oh, from the perspective of the Labang Education Foundation, a lot has changed. We have had to revisit almost all of our programs. In the sense that, okay, let me just give a typical example. The last time I was in Cameroon for studies on what the foundation needed to do was in September 2016. So when I left Cameroon in September 2016, I was living with a plan on what we were going to accomplish between 2016 and 2018. And then in November, the crisis started, schools got disrupted, and then early 2017, it became an armed conflict. So we have had to change a lot of things. We have had to carry on construction of our training centers, of schools within the conflict, which has been a very challenging, very challenging experience, not only from the security perspective, but from the economic perspective, and even from the labor force perspective.
The burden has increased as well. The burden has increased as well.
A lot of money. And I remember talking to somebody in the Northwest, and they asked me, prices have almost doubled on everything. Why do you keep pushing on this project? I told them, well, prices have increased, but guess what? If we do not continue these projects, part of the problem is going to be more violence, because more and more young people who should have been involved in useful employment activities will now become idle, and they can become targets of either sides of the conflict.
Thank you very much.
Apart from that,
thank you very much, Doc. I'm sorry we have to end it here. We'll find time to talk more about the foundation and what you have been doing in Cameroon. It was a pleasure having you from Texas, USA, talking to My Media Prime.
Thank you very much, Kingsley, and thanks to My Media Prime for the wonderful job you guys are doing.
You're welcome.